IVM.
On December 2, 1977, two men walked out to the centre of a cricket field to toss a coin. The venue was the VFL Park in Melbourne, which had a capacity of 80,000 people. And yet, there were only 500 spectators in this large ground. There was just one in-house photographer to record the moment. At the toss, when the coin finally hit the ground, you could probably have heard it in that silent, empty stadium. This was a match that was not recognized by the ICC, a match with few spectators. And yet, it was the legend Garfield Sobers who was supervising the toss, and the two captains were Ian Chappell and Clive Lloyd. This was the day that cricket changed forever.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My topic for today is money in cricket. And I will be examining this topic through the prism of World Series cricket and the IPL. My guests today are both legends of cricket writing, Gideon Haigh and Prem Panicker. Gideon is an Australian cricket writer who has written more than 30 books. Many of them are about cricket, the rest about business and economics, which makes Kerry Packer's World Series an ideal subject for him, as it falls at the intersection of both. His first cricket book, The Cricket War, the inside story of Kerry Packer's World Series cricket, was released in 1993, and it was released in India in a new edition a few days ago. Prem Panicker needs no introduction to cricket lovers in India. He was probably the first blogger in the world, long before blogs even existed, with his cricket updates for Rediff in the mid-1990s. He is also an authority on media and on politics, and like me, he's followed the IPL very closely. I caught up with Gideon and Prem at the Bangalore Literature Festival last weekend and recorded this episode with them there. Here we go. Gideon, Prem, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Gideon, I have in my hands right now your first book, The Cricket War, which is releasing now in India for the first time. And
a little bit late. It took a while to get here.
Yeah, and you wrote it in the early 90s.
I did, yes.
It essentially covers World Series cricket and how Kerry Packer transformed the game.
Yes.
And all of that is incredibly relevant even today, because all those fundamental questions about the commercialization of the game, about what it does to the spirit of the game, the way it is played and so on, are incredibly relevant no matter which side of the fence you fall upon. And you mentioned that, when rereading this book now, you felt that it was still incredibly relevant for what we're going through these days.
Well, I mean, what does strike me when I reflect on World Series cricket now is how incredibly audacious it was. If you think about where cricket was in 1977, you had the occasion of the Centenary Test, which was the celebration of all good things about Test cricket, honouring the fact that there'd been the first Test match in March 1877. It was a great pretext for self-congratulation about the stature that the game had achieved, its place in the national life, its role in the Commonwealth, its upholding of certain values that people like to believe about the game as embodying. And then, even as that test match was in progress, there was a private entrepreneur with a broadcasting company recruiting the best cricketers in the world for his own roll your own television spectacular. There's never been anything quite so audacious since then. And in the course of the next 2 years, cricket would learn a great deal about the effects of the arrival of private capital. It would receive a timely education in the value of commercial rights, which of course have underpinned the game's growth for the subsequent 40 years. The players would get a first feeling for their role as something other than mere athletes. They became celebrities, if you like, for the first time. They became commercial properties to be bought and sold. And for the first time, we saw the potential that was latent in one-day cricket, a new variant on an old theme. There'd only really been relatively few one-day internationals before World Series cricket. After World Series cricket, the format goes forth and multiplies, not least of all in India.
And just taking a tangent off before exploring
Sure.
that further, do you believe in the great man theory of history? I mean, would this revolution have happened without Packer? Or is cricket, in that sense, was he necessary for it?
I do think it was a bit of a perfect storm. It was a very unusual concatenation of circumstances in 1977. You had a game that was very, very popular, and there's no doubt about it. Cricket in 1977 was hugely popular. In Australia in particular, because it had this very vital, gregarious, exciting team, Lillian Thompson, the Chappells, Marsh, etc., who felt nonetheless alienated and underpaid and exploited by their administrators because they compared their rewards to those that were available in individual sports such as tennis and golf, which were rapidly professionalising off the back of television. You had the rights for the commercial and broadcasting rights for that cricket were being significantly undersold. They were basically in the hands of a national broadcaster that broadcast the game essentially on a kind of a grace and favour basis, I guess in much the same way as Doordarshan had in India forever and a day. You had a set of players who had a kind of an accumulation of about 10 years' worth of grievances with their administrators and an administrative class that I think had become dangerously separated by a generation and more from the attitudes of their players. And you had certain stars, Dennis Lilly notably, and the Chappells, who had links in with people in other pursuits. The important figures in World Series cricket are not simply Kerry, Packer and the players, but they're people like John Cornell and Austin Robertson and Paul Hogan, who played such an important part in bringing the players and Packer as an impresario together. I think that where Packer had a unique advantage was that he was quite a young man. He's only 39 in 1977. He's trying to make his own way in the world, out from under the influence or the reputation of his late father, who had been a great press baron, Sir Frank, in his own right. He was looking not necessarily to make his name, but to create something of his own. And he'd already revolutionised the magazine market in Australia by setting up the first really significant sort of new wave women's magazine, Cleo. And he was fascinated by sport, the potential of sport to create lots of content throughout the year, relatively cheap to produce, embroidered with natural ad breaks, which naturally captured the nation's imagination. I don't think any single individual, with the possible exception of Rupert Murdoch in Australia, could have had quite the same grand conception about the role of sport as a kind of a commercial battering ram. I think the players too tended to gravitate towards an individual, a compelling individual such as Packer, rather than necessarily a faceless corporate enterprise, because players naturally defer to an inspirational authority. And the minute that Packer really had the Chappells on their side, and Lilly, who were such important opinion makers in their own generation, it was inevitable, really, that all the players would follow. They were very susceptible to the influence of these strong men of Australian cricket at that time. Perhaps these days they might take a slightly more sort of individual and selfish attitude, but then the Australian cricket team moved as a block, and they were kind of arm in arm from that point forward for the next.
And they were
years.
sort of used to moving as a block, right? Because for the past few years they had been fighting for higher wages.
They had, yes. It has this backdrop of kind of constant agitation about not just pay but also conditions and prestige and treatment. The touchstone that I know Chappelli talks about all the time is the 1970 tour of South Africa, where the Australian players were playing they were on a double tour. They'd played against India. They'd come from India. They'd beaten India at home, but it had been a terribly, terribly arduous tour. They went to South Africa. They were smashed by a very great South African team, and the cricket board tried to persuade them to play an extra test. And Chappelli said, well, basically, you'd have to get us to sign another contract, and we're not going to sign another contract. And that was the first evidence that the players were capable of defying their administrators. The administrators chose to back off in that confrontation, but it did give the players a bit of a feeling for their power if they acted collectively. Interestingly, we've seen further evidence of that during the recent pay dispute in Australia, where the players did stick to one another, both the male and the female players, international and domestic, and it proved that in the end, if you couldn't break them, if you couldn't divide them, then they did have the opportunity to assert their will.
And would you say that players today have a much greater sense of what they're actually worth than perhaps they did back then?
For sure. But they also have... This was a bit of an education for us all in Australia recently. I think that the belief had built up that players now looked after themselves individually because of the way in which the IPL auction kind of carves up the players as individual lots and sells them for different prices, that they somehow had a different attitude to industrial relations. We learned a different lesson in Australia this summer, that the players look at each other and they say, "What are you doing?" And if one of them says, "We're sticking together," then that's what they tend to do. Still, even in this day and age.
And they're catering to the self-interest by doing that because they're much likelier to get a good deal if they do collective bargaining.
Yes.
So what was the reaction to World Series cricket back then among the general public, for example?
Well, I can recall my own action. I was a 11-year-old child who was massively excited about cricket, really coming to terms with the game for the first time. And I was shocked, appalled that the players would desert all these things that I'd been told were vitally important. Tradition, etiquette, the honour of representing your country, the fact that the game was beyond price. To my prim 11-year-old sensibilities, that was a gross affront. At the same time, part of me was absolutely fascinated by this new enterprise. It was so different, it was so exciting, it was so colourful, it was so full of personality. And it was another channel. How exciting to have cricket on 2 channels all of a sudden. So over the course of the next 2 years, I probably went on the same kind of journey as the Australian public, in the sense that having gotten over my initial shock, I began to see that there was value in this new kind of cricket, that it afforded opportunities for greater remuneration for players, which no doubt they deserved. It was exciting, it was accessible, it was innovative, because for the first time we saw players playing in helmets, we saw them playing under lights, we saw them playing in coloured clothes, we saw a vastly enhanced television coverage, the kind of thing that we take these days for granted, but really World Series cricket is the first iteration of that evolution of the game, which is more than simply being a kind of a silent, distant witness to the game. Cameras for the first time kind of got close up to the action and really dwelt on it and teased out all its possibilities and replayed endlessly from all conceivable angles. We forget that Packer introduced the standard innovation of filming cricket from both ends, because when I started watching cricket in the mid-1970s, you saw it from one end only. You saw it, from behind the bowler's arm in one over, and then from behind the batsman in the next. And Packer said, "Well, I can't stand looking at batsmen's arses half the time. I want to see it from behind the bowler's arm each time." And that's an amazing change of perspective.
And it also underscores that this sport is one that is played for the audience. You want to give them the best experience.
Yes.
It's not just that the sport is happening and as a matter of fact you're showing it to people. But that the audience is at the center of it. So that simple change almost seems to epitomize that. So now my next question is sort of a multi-part question. What kind of changes did World Series cricket kickstart in cricket in 3 aspects? 1, the game itself, the way it was played. 2, the lives of all the stakeholders involved, players, administrators, and so on. And 3, in terms of cricket's place in the culture, because like you correctly said, it had a place in the culture that went beyond mere mindless entertainment. You have phrases in the English language like, that's not cricket. Thereby it embodied that set of values. So in all these 3
I'll start with the third one first, because I think that is the most interesting. It's a very good quote from an Australian writer called Greg Manning, an academic, who said that Packer didn't spend all that money to buy cricket. He spent that money turning cricket into something that he could buy. For the first time, cricket was turned into a tradable commodity. It was something that could be bought and sold. Players could be bought and sold. In a sense, that liberation of kind of animal spirits is something that we're still coming to terms with. It did instill in players an idea that they were entities in a free market of entertainment who could sell themselves potentially to the highest possible bidder. In some senses, it's almost impossible to conceive of the rebel tours of the 1980s having gone ahead, if not for what had happened in 1977. It made players think, okay, I'm only around for a short period of time, I should take opportunity of whatever opportunities, take advantage of whatever opportunities come my way, and that pariahhood can be survived. Because for 2 years, those players were kind of non-persons in the eyes of the establishment game, and yet in 1979, everything went back to the way it had been. And the players in that period had, for that short period, had been greatly enriched. The first part of your question, what did it do to the game? Well, in some respects, Packer was predominantly a great resurfacer of the game. He didn't sort of fundamentally change the balance between bat and ball. He didn't invent a new kind of bowling. What he did was he popularised a form of cricket that had already been explored by the establishment. We'd already had the World Cup of 1975. We'd seen the pent-up potential of one-day cricket. What we hadn't done was take full commercial advantage of it. And once it had been demonstrated that people would turn up for innovations like night cricket, then the establishment was able to take advantage of that. The interesting thing about the pact that Packer strikes with the game in 1979 is that he gets an even better deal than he initially bargained on, because PBL Marketing, his organisation, becomes the official marketing arm of the Australian Cricket Board. So he's basically getting to prepare his own attractions for television. He gets a chance to participate in the creation of the marketing and the advertising that is going to be screened on his own television network. That's an amazing power. In fact, Channel 9 lost that power in the mid-1990s, but they held it for a long time. So Packer was really able to reshape cricket according to the values of his own, the priorities of his own television station. That was a remarkable innovation. And broadcasters got a sense that they could influence kind of on-field outcomes. They could influence the way in which the calendar was structured. That because they were bringing such rewards to the game through commercial opportunities, they had a say in the way in which cricket was run.
Prem, let me turn to you now. You've been writing about cricket, covering cricket since the mid-1990s, and coincidentally that also happens to be around the time the Indian Cricket Board and Indian cricket began to discover its commercial potential, where suddenly it became mass-marketed entertainment. Players started earning a lot, which is a great thing. And then, 10 years ago, we had the IPL come up, and that seems in many ways like the World Series on steroids. And we've both celebrated aspects of it and lamented aspects of it. So what do you feel about what you've seen in these years?
Well, one of the things that struck me about Gideon's exposition of how Packer changed or brought an entirely new paradigm into cricket is the fact that there was thought behind every single thing that was done. There was a set of circumstances that came together to create both a dissatisfaction and therefore an opportunity. And there was a person who was smart enough to do the math, see the opportunity, and ultimately, as Gideon said, he ended up gaining far more than he would have gained if they had listened to him in the first place. I think the one thing that strikes me about Indian cricket, and that's true from even before the 90s, but certainly true from the 90s on till very recently, and this includes the inception of the IPL, is that there has never been any thought at any stage of development. It is either that you've tripped over something and fallen into something and then realized that you got lucky and fell with your face pointing the right way, or you have been forced by external circumstances to an innovation has been to circumvent somebody else from innovating. So the ICL this became a preventive measure because you probably know this because you were covering cricket at the same time. Lalit Modi had been speaking about this forever.
Since 95.
Even during the Dalmia regime, he had repeatedly gone and done presentations.
In fact, I interviewed Bindra in I think 2002 or 2003, and that's on the Cricinfo site where Bindra talked about it. He said there's this guy called Lalit Modi who's got this great idea. But the interesting thing is there's a great photograph in this edition of his book which is launching, which shows Subhash Chandra posing like a media baron, almost like an Indian packer. And in that sense, with ICL, he forced the issue because Lalit Modi and the BCCI was kind of sitting on the idea for a while. And then the ICL happened and it was a rebel league and all of these players joined and that forced the issue on the BCCI.
Yeah, which was kind of my point that it's always been somebody's always had to drag Indian cricket kicking and screaming from one era into another while they drag their heels. I mean, that's true, the IPL, but even the period that you were talking about of discovering the commercial properties, again, it was completely happenstance. I mean, it was an egoistic bid that brought the World Cup to India in the first place. It was not a commercial consideration. Having done that, you were desperately in trouble, and then the whole Indian jugaad system works because somebody who knows the Ambanis, who at that point were trying to put a benign face at a time when they were getting slammed for pretty much everything, Dhirubhai Ambani's time, and they realized that identifying with cricket was pretty much a passport.
And that leads to the Reliance World Cup.
Yeah, it was a nice little whitewash and stuff like that. So they come in and money comes in, and it's always been serendipitous, and sometimes the benign effects of something are in front of their face, and you find the BCCI is still resisting it. Until somebody gives them a kick up the backside.
Would it be fair to say that all of these changes, what World Series brought about and what has happened in India in the last 20 years, were inevitable? Except that Packer came slightly ahead of the curve and he forced the issue.
Yeah.
And in India, they were bound to happen and they happened and they would have happened anyway, but there was no visionary figure like Packer leading the way.
Yeah, for me, what is amusing about that whole thing is that, it was inevitable. The set of circumstances or the set of disaffections that Gideon outlined had to erupt at some point or the other because you couldn't see a logical sequence where these things built and what. I mean, it's not like vapor just escaping. It had to result in an outburst. It so happened that it was Packer who was poised and had the wit and the intelligence to take advantage. But one way or the other, something had to happen. The funny thing about it was, forget about the changes in cricket and stuff like today, in the last 4 or 5 years, say 10 years max, we fetishize a disruption. We have entire conferences that are, for me, I mean, what Packer did, that was disruption. He took something that was that had a history, it had a deep root in culture, in thing, and he just said, I'm not tampering with it, I'm just coming at it from another way, like Mac did with notebooks. They didn't invent the computer, they didn't invent a different computer. They just made it friendlier.
So you could say Packer Uberized cricket.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, he was disruption before people started thinking of disruption as a means of taking your business to the next level. And we are, like I said, we really need to...
few things are more ripe for disruption than a monopoly, aren't they?
Exactly.
All national boards are inherently monopolies. They arrogate to themselves the right to hold official cricket within their territorial boundaries.
Not just this, they're monopsonies because the cricketers can't sell their services anywhere else. And and I've written about this a lot, and I can't figure out a solution to this because it's obviously undesirable. But what do you do about it? And the typical answer that fellow free marketers often give is that look, the BCCI may have a monopoly and a monopsony on cricket in India, but they are competing with other sports and other forms of entertainment, and that will be the corrective that they need. And I'm not sure how good an answer that is, but it seems to be the best answer at this point. But that kind of brings me to this next question, that just as cricket has changed, the world has also changed in the way we consume entertainment, and I'm loosely categorizing all sport as entertainment. Whatever we choose to do with our time as entertainment has changed. And much as I'm a purist and I love Test cricket more than anything else, and it is true that the opportunity cost of Test cricket is very high in this day and age. Back in the day when you didn't have much to do with your time, watching a 5-day Test match made sense. But today you have so many competing demands on your time, including on your smartphone, where there's so much of addictive entertainment happening. That does Test cricket have a future? And was it inevitable that we are eventually going to make that journey from 5-day cricket to 1-day cricket to T20 cricket now?
Maybe even T10. That's the next stage, isn't it?
Oh my God!
I know. It's barely bears thinking about, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think that it's perfectly possible to imagine that as a potential scenario. What we need to reflect on, I think, is what we would lose in that process, and what we are losing in the accenting of the short forms of the game is the idea of the epic, the performance of scale, the idea of endurance, that dimension that cricket has had that other sports do not, except when you see an epic 5-setter between Federer and Nadal. It wouldn't have been better as a 3-setter or a 2-setter, would it? It actually needs that duration. It needs that rise and fall. It needs that push and pull. You can't have everything proceeding in a series of explosive moments, because explosive moments, well, they impress themselves on the mind, but in a very disorganised way. I mean, isn't it fascinating that you can still remember test matches that you saw in the 1970s or the 1980s or the 1990s, but it's actually quite difficult to remember that T20 game that you saw last week. I think you need both. In an ideal world, you would have a perfect balance between both the kind of the sugar hit that the short form operates and the more wholesome sustenance that I think the long form has. But you're right. I think in the end, economics might be the ultimate determinant. You have to come up with some sort of estimation of what you would lose economically. And I think there is a cost to the fading value of Test cricket. Test cricket does anchor us. It does provide us with a sense of continuity, a sense of generational renewal. It provides the forum for players to be great. T20 provides a forum for players to be spectacular and explosive and eye-catching, but it doesn't really allow us to study them at length and up close in all their manifestations and to see the full range of their skills and the full complexities of the game. That doesn't make it a bad form. That makes it a certain kind of cricket that if only that kind of cricket was on offer, then the game would be somehow diminished.
And also to take that forward, I'd say that like a 5-day test match is far richer than, say, a 5-setter in tennis.
Yeah.
Because the 5th set is really pretty similar to the first set in terms of your playing conditions, and it's the same two players, and you could even interchange them sometimes. So obviously there's a change in context. But the richness of a 5-day test where a pitch is crumbling and you're fighting to, chase 187 against a good attack, or, the kind of drama and joy that, say, Gavaskar's last innings 96 against Pakistan on that spinning track brings, and there's really nothing in T20 cricket which can kind of capture that. But what is the value of that and what is the price of that?
Yeah, so here's the thing, right? Gideon pretty much laid it out, and your question supplies its own answer, that we are increasingly trying to figure out, being cricket tragics, you probably feel that somehow something must be done to preserve Test cricket and to encourage Test cricket and stuff like that. And being pragmatic, you realize that it's drawing fewer and fewer crowds and it's making lesser amounts of money every single time. The logic, the economics, everything is making us very strong case for Test cricket being pretty much phased out of the equation. But counterintuitively, I'll try a hypothetical. What if there wasn't any issues with India and Pakistan, or magically the issues had resolved themselves last night, and we announced that India and Pakistan were going to play a 5-test series in India starting next month? What do you think the crowds would be? What do you think the money-making potential would be? Where does that come from? It comes from the fact that it has a narrative, but that narrative was largely made by us, and by us I mean the boards, the organizers, the society, the media, all of us, right? I mean, the narrative didn't exist otherwise. It didn't exist in a vacuum. The ashes which draws packed houses even today, despite the fact that, you have some landmark ashes, like the 2005 was the last really, the storied ashes. I'm pretty certain that this ashes, again, you will get a sellout crowd. The reason being, there is a strong narrative that has been created by the marketing wing of cricket, by the administrative wing of cricket, by the media, which is complicit in the manufacture of pretty much every single narrative. We do not create similar narratives for such events outside of England plays. Australia and India is never going to play Pakistan in the conceivable future. So we're left with a single narrative, which has to bear the entire burden of lifting cricket. And that's not a...
And I'm left with a slight mixed feeling about this in the sense that I understand that if India plays Pakistan, that larger narrative of what the rivalry has been like plays a part in drawing a lot of people. But equally, it would seem that just the more basic narrative of these are the 11 players versus these 11 players, and it's their skills out and their personal life histories sort of, coming to this is also a fascinating narrative which will appeal to cricket tragics like us perhaps, but not
precisely. But that particular narrative of 11 against 11 playing for two countries
is harder to sell.
We haven't seen that narrative for any time in the last 20, 25 years. It's always, there needs to be a trigger. India-Australia was it was brilliant marketing. And it kicked off because Saurav Ganguly came along at a time when you had a strong-willed Steve Waugh at the other end, and Saurav played the import, tease and torment. That became the narrative of that entire series. Despite the fact that it had magnificent performances on both sides. It had one of the most magical days of cricket when these two guys got together. Lakshman and Dravid got together and turned the series on its head. What do we still remember? The first memory that comes is Saurav being late for 2 test matches, and then when that becomes a thing, Saurav deliberately comes 10 minutes early and stands there like, look at me. And, we never... And remember, that is two of the best lots of players you had. You would expect that the narrative would have been about how Steve Waugh will counter the Indian bowling, or how Lakshman and Dravid and Tendulkar and the others would counter the Aussie bowling led by Vaughan and McGrath. And
the other interesting thing about the mythology of Test cricket is that when India played Australia or India played Pakistan, or you have an Ashes series, all the players are almost sort of mythic figures. Yes. They've got their stories, they're part of that. While today what you have is with the preponderance of T20 leagues and so on, they're familiar to the extent where they no longer have the same aura, no matter how good they are. I don't think a Steve Smith will ever have the kind of aura that, say, Waugh had back then. Simply because we are so much more familiar with...
and T20, one of the points that Gideon made is that you can't remember what happened last week.
Right.
But that very thing, the same test players are also playing T20. They're playing in the IPL, they're playing in international T20s and stuff like that. Somewhere along the way, their skills are getting trivialized. And so I don't know how much of that aura that you're talking about I would still have if I'd seen, say, a Steve Waugh play T20 and a Mark Waugh play. We were talking this morning about the styles of the stylistics of Mark Waugh and stuff like that. You have them trotting out in coloured clothes and trying to hit the first ball for a six and stuff like that, and suddenly Mark Waugh is just human. He's just another guy. But somewhere along the way, T20 is, to my way of looking at it, diminishing the mythical aspect of some of these test players.
So having said that, tell me your reaction to this. And this is something which fellow cricket tragics often get shocked when I express. But I think A, T20 is a completely different sport from Test cricket, and it's unfair to compare them. And B, I think what T20 cricket has done, what one day cricket did to a certain extent, but T20 cricket has done much more, is that it has given players new skill sets, which have even gone and enhanced the original game.
Well, I think what it's done is it's changed the nature of skill. Previously, skill operated on one axis, probably, let's say, a vertical axis. It was all about the ability to reproduce certain core skills consistently to a very high standard. It was a relatively narrow set of
Keep
skills.
it simple, do it well, again and again.
Exactly. Glenn McGrath, perhaps the ultimate example, the bowler who could just land the ball on a sixpence over and over again and do a little bit either way. Inherently kind of undramatic cricketer, but with an amazingly robust mechanism and an endless patience. Skill now works on a kind of a horizontal axis. It's a range of skills. Cricketers are more skillful. They have, well, in the sense that they have more skills than perhaps they ever have before. What they perhaps don't have is the robust mechanism that allows for their constant repetition. But the accent is now on variety rather than consistency, isn't it? It's the ability to access 360 degrees to the ground. It's the ability to bowl 6 different balls in an over so as to maximise the disruption to the opponent's rhythm. So you actually have 2 games now sort of operating at right angles to one another. It is amazing when you see the skills migrate from one format to another. I actually thought the World Cup in 2015 was utterly fascinating, precisely because you got kind of test match quality bowling, because the accent was on the only way to slow down batsmen these days is to get them out, and T20 batting skills on show, and they both kind of meshed to this new model of ODI cricket, which made it, for a very heady brew, that's why I found it such a compelling tournament to watch.
In fact, I often express the unpopular opinion that Virat Kohli is the most skilled Indian batsman there has ever been. And I felt pretty much the same about A.B. de Villiers in the sense that he can do things that no batsman in history could have imagined.
Yes.
I don't know if you heard Gideon at a panel at the Bangalore Lit Festival. He made this point about having talked to a lot of contemporary Australian players. I think he mentioned some 25, 26 players. And he was saying that one of the things that he found uniformly among these players is that because of the breakdown of traditional structures, you're playing T20 as an international player, but you're also playing it for your club and for various clubs around the world and stuff like that the players are no longer as invested in the outcome of an individual match as they used to be. They don't suffer the defeats as much, and they don't, celebrate the victories as much because there's another game coming along. And
which I would argue as a former poker player is actually the correct attitude.
Correct.
You can't be results-oriented in this process.
But then, to your question, one of the fun things, and I don't know how you will prove this empirically, but if you're not invested in the result, then the fear of the result is also taken away from your mind.
And that takes away some of the drama.
No, but you're able to go out there and play without that fear. Where Gideon started talking about, doing the right thing and then just repeating it ad infinitum throughout the day, that's no longer your mindset. Your mindset is, it's not about what I've been trained to do, it is about doing exactly what I'm not expected to do. And that is adding a certain richness to the vocabulary of cricket.
I think
that you would bowl a full toss deliberately.
Yeah, but if McGrath was bowling today, I think he'd bowl exactly the same way and be as effective, if not more. Why would he not? McGrath, in fact, to me, exemplifies that approach of process over results, where you just keep on doing the right thing and the results come by themselves.
But I would still love to see McGrath going up against a Virat Kohli or a A.B. de Villiers today.
Who can just hit him off his
No, also because he's so very predictable in where he's going to land the ball, give it a centimetre to the left or a centimetre to the right. You can decide to go down the wicket to him because you know what the length is going to be. You can decide to switch the bat around and play him to angles that McGrath, when doing that, has never been challenged in an unorthodox fashion. You play McGrath orthodox and you will just keep... McGrath versus Dravid is the ultimate cricket thing because neither of them will...
waver from what they do.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And
one thing I would say in McGrath's favour, I suspect that as a great player, he would have adapted to whatever circumstances offered. He was also incredibly psychologically strong.
Yeah.
And that is something that is required of players these days. For a bowler to be able to come back and bowl a good delivery, having been hit for 6 the previous ball, that requires an immense poise and concentration and faith in one's own ability, and I think McGrath had all those things.
So would it then be fair to say that if it is the case that McGrath would have been challenged more by contemporary batsmen,
every bowler is challenged,
and would have lifted himself accordingly, that the contemporary age of cricket has actually lifted the quality of play overall? because people are challenged more and have to, just using that particular example.
I think it's made players more brilliant and more brittle. I think it's made momentum much more important. It is interesting to see how test teams just seem to disintegrate now. How one team gets on top and the other side just falls away almost abjectly, pitifully.
Because the defiance is a lost art.
Yes. Well, they've got lots of skills, but they have them only in one dimension. And if those skills don't work, they don't really seem to have much to fall back on. I'd be interested to see. There's been a lot of talk lately about how quickly games are ending because of this advocacy of 4-day test matches. I'd be interested to see what the trend is in margins in test matches. Certainly, it's observably true over the last 10 years that the margins in Ashes test matches, both one way and the other, have been just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. We're just not seeing close test matches anymore.
That's really interesting. And going back to, a classic batsman versus bowler struggle that I remember, Atherton versus Donald, would it then be fair to say that if instead in Atherton's place there was a modern day batsman, maybe Atherton himself with 10 years of T20 cricket behind him, would his approach be different, A, and would his approach be better, B?
It's an interesting question. I've asked Mike this directly. I said that when you were playing the game, there was no batting coach in the England setup. How do you think you would have used a batting coach? Do you think it would have made you any better player? And his answer was actually quite a thoughtful one. He said that towards the end of his career, he had begun sort of fiddling almost compulsively with his technique, partly because of his bad back, just to feel more comfortable at the crease. He said the most valuable coaching that he ever received was just the reinforcement not to make changes, just to rely on doing things simply, to have faith in yourself, that degree of reinforcement. It's interesting that a man as psychologically strong as Mike would have required that degree of reinforcement. But that was something that he did feel that he'd missed out on. Mike loved the battle. Mike loved resistance. In a sense, that is quite an old-fashioned quality these days. Players want to lead the game. Players want to take the aggressive role. Mike loved to withstand. And at his best, there was probably no one better. I suspect that withstanding is something that's kind of enduring, like a rock in the face of erosion, is something that's kind of going by the board, because there is this constant accent on enterprise, on taking control of the game, of forcing the game, imposing your will and imposing your momentum.
And to be fair, in the shorter form of the game, aggression is just more positive EV.
Yes.
It just pays more than resilience does, and because players play so much more of that, that almost perhaps becomes reflexive to them, which is why I'm wondering if a modern day batsman playing Donald like that would just say that, heck, I'm not going to try to survive 5 overs because he's really good, he's going to get me. I'm just going to try and hit him out of the attack.
Interesting line in Peterson's last book, which I was reading just recently. He talked about batting with Jonathan Trott, and he said that Trotty was kind of a bit of a figure of fun in the England dressing room, or at least to bat with him, because he was constantly talking in mid-pitch about how he was going to take the bowler on, how he was going to hit him back over his head, how he was going to take the initiative. And he went back to his end and he just went on playing the way that he always did. Peterson said, interestingly, that at least that demonstrated a positive mindset, that even if he was getting into position to play aggressive shots, even if he didn't actually play them, you're naturally a better player if you're thinking positive thoughts. Even if you don't actually attack, at least thinking of attack puts you into better shapes and makes you more resilient under those circumstances.
That's fascinating. I'd like to end by asking both of you 2 questions. Question 1, what makes you more hopeful about the future of cricket? And question 2, what gives you despair about what is happening in cricket today?
Well, the thing that always makes me hopeful about playing cricket is playing it. I play for a club. I played for this same club for about 24 years. I'm the games record holder there. I'm disappointed to be in Bangalore today because it means that I'm missing a game this weekend. I love it more than ever. I love getting out there. I love my teammates. I love the challenges that cricket throws up. I love the unique perspective that you have as a player. There are certain insights that only the player has, that we as journalists in our daily life will never have the same view of the game. I think the love of the game among those who play it is still abiding. And frankly, when I'm out there, I'm just constantly surprised by what a great game it is. How uniquely satisfying, how uniquely skillful, how uniquely fun and full of comradeship it is. How it can blend people from different backgrounds. How it teaches respect for opponents. It teaches respect for officials. It humbles you before it constantly. Just at that very moment where you think you've got it mastered, it turns around and bites you in the bum. The thing that cricket has going for it most today is the game itself.
And what makes you pessimistic?
My concern is the constant bending out of shape of the game by kind of exogenous factors, by commercial agendas, by political and administrative ambition. And I don't detect in those constituencies the same deep and abiding love that those who play the game have.
Prem?
Yeah, I happened to watch one particular day, actually 3 days of the recent India-Australia Test series in 3 different sports bars. Partly because my wife threatened to throw me out if I had cricket at volume. But what was striking was, you remember that rearguard thing that Hanscom and Sean Marsh played. This was a young audience. It's a bar. And kids. And they sat riveted through that entire thing. Who thought? And the audience at the ground was transfixed by that thing. And it was absolutely brilliant, because you realize that for all the talk, and that audience would never have possibly seen some of the great, rearguards of even the Atherton era, and before that the Gavaskars and all the people that we celebrated at our thing. Just the sheer contest, even though nothing was happening, it was mostly just being played back to a fielder or whatever. The contest held them riveted, and somewhere I think that ultimately we look at a lot of external factors to explain what may or may not happen to the game, and I think if the game just lifts itself up, I think it has a future. And
what keeps you hopeful is therefore just the inherent drama of the game itself.
At its best, it is one of the most entrancing thing, and I don't mean the sixes that are flying. I mean the contest.
Absolutely,
it has that narrative scope to it. What makes me despair? I'll take off from what Gideon said. I think you look at what is happening in sports administration at the ICC level, or at the more civilized cricket boards like Australia, for instance, and then the dark ages of India. Every single innovation, every single tweak and twist is all with a very short-term gain in mind. And each one of these is independent of the other, sometimes contradictory to the other. And it is not leading in an organized fashion to all the questions that you have been concerned with in the course of this thing. I don't see the administration asking itself those questions and addressing those.
I mean, they're essentially just corporate suits.
Yeah.
They're looking at the bottom.
So why would you have Sri Lanka come back and tour again? I mean, what possible logic did you have? The only logic you had was, here's a broadcaster who's given us a shitload of money and we need to make him happy, therefore let's give him some.
And you dilute the drama, and you also disillusion the players who are just getting
exactly.
too much.
So, where you were looking at a team that is all conquering and stuff like that, and you've built up the mythos around Virat and his invincibles, and you suddenly have them playing school kids. I'm sorry, I mean, I have full respect for Sri Lankan cricket, but right now they happen to be, unfortunately, at a point of transition. They're not opposition. They should be playing Zimbabwe and finding their way back. And you host them here for longer than you're going to be in South Africa. And in what world that makes any kind of sense, I don't know. So if the game gives me hope, the administration of the game gives me total despair. And that's
So we can end on a hopeful note that even if, the administration of the game tries to take it backwards, we, the fans, will fight and we will flourish. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Amen. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can buy Gideon's book, The Cricket War, at the bookstore nearest to you, which is probably Amazon. You can follow Prem on Twitter at Prem Panicker. That's PREMPANICKER. And you can follow me at Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. All the archives of The Seen and the Unseen are available at seenunseen.in. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed listening to The Seen and the Unseen, check out another great show by IVM Podcasts, Made in India, hosted by my friend May Thomas, where every week she profiles up-and-coming independent Indian bands.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. Sorry to say, but there's been a slight delay due to the apocalypse having suddenly begun. As you can see, there's death, destruction, and chaos taking place all around us. But don't you worry, food and drinks will be served shortly, and I would recommend checking out IVM Podcasts to get some of your favorite Indian podcasts. We'll keep you going till this whole thing blows over. Thank you.